My parents forbade me from their anniversary party, telling me my attitude simply did not fit the elegant vibe they needed for the evening. Hours later, my sister posted a photo from the country club with the caption, "Family only." I did not cry or beg for an invitation. I just hit like and commented, "Congrats, mortgage and taxes are all yours now." Exactly 7 minutes later, the post was gone, and 40 missed calls appeared on my screen. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep who secretly carried the whole family on your back, only to be treated like you were nothing. I am Maya, 35 years old, and the founder and CEO of Vanguard Holdings, a distressed property investment firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. On the surface, my family looked like the pinnacle of affluent suburban success. My father, Calvin, was a prominent deacon at one of the largest megachurches in the city, a man whose entire existence revolved around social standing and public perception. My mother, Evelyn, was his perfect counterpart, always dressed in designer labels, hosting charity luncheons, and making sure everyone knew just how blessed we supposedly were. Then there was my younger sister, Chloe, the undisputed golden child. Chloe had never worked a hard day in her life, gliding through private schools and a communications degree paid for in full by our parents. 2 years ago, she married Trent, a loud, arrogant tech bro who practically demanded a seat at the head of our family table. Trent was white, wealthy, presenting, and full of grandiose ideas about cryptocurrency and real estate. To my parents, he was the ultimate prize, the golden son-in-law who would elevate our family status even further. To them, I was the difficult one. The aggressive, independent woman who worked too much, asked too many questions, and refused to play the role of the quiet, accommodating daughter. I built my real estate empire from absolute scratch, working 18-hour days, skipping holidays to close deals, and risking everything I had to build Vanguard Holdings into a quiet powerhouse in the Atlanta market. My family knew I was in real estate, but they thought I was just some glorified house flipper struggling to make ends meet. I never corrected them. I learned early on that sharing my successes only led to my mother criticizing my lack of a husband, or my father asking for a temporary loan that he never intended to repay. It was a Saturday night, and I was sitting in my downtown penthouse office overlooking the sprawling lights of Midtown and Buckhead. The city was alive, but my office was perfectly silent. I poured myself a generous glass of aged bourbon and stared at my phone resting on the heavy mahogany desk. Earlier that morning, I had received a voicemail from my mother that I had already replayed half a dozen times. Her voice, dripping with that familiar condescending sweetness, echoed in the quiet room. Maya, Trent's parents flew in from Boston for our 40th anniversary dinner at the club tonight, she had said, sighing, as if my very existence was a burden she had to endure. We are keeping it very intimate. Your aggressive independence and your whole attitude just do not fit the elegant vibe we need tonight. Trent's parents are very traditional, and we do not have enough space at the table for your negativity. Do not come to the club. Just stay home, and we will catch up next week. Stay home. Do not come to the club. We do not have enough space at the table for you. The words were a sharp, familiar blade twisting in my chest. They were celebrating 4 decades of marriage, an event I had actually helped fund in the background, and I was explicitly banned so I would not embarrass them in front of Trent's family. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I did not shed a tear. I was past crying over their rejection. I picked up my phone and opened Instagram. Right at the top of my feed was a fresh post from Chloe. It was a professionally taken photograph on the sweeping green lawn of the country club. Calvin was wearing a custom tuxedo, looking like the proud patriarch. Evelyn was beside him, draped in pearls and a sequined gown. Chloe stood on the other side, wearing a dress that cost more than a reliable used car, clinging to Trent, who wore a smug, self-satisfied grin. Trent's wealthy parents were positioned right in the center. The entire group was raising crystal champagne flutes to the camera. The image itself was hurtful enough, but it was the caption that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. Celebrating 40 years of Black excellence, family only. Family only. They were standing there projecting an image of untouchable generational wealth and flawless family unity while deliberately erasing the daughter who had literally kept a roof over their heads. I stared at Trent's smug face in the photo. He looked so incredibly proud of himself, believing he was the savior of the family, the brilliant businessman who had secured their legacy. He had absolutely no idea what he had just walked into. 3 years ago, my parents' obsession with maintaining their image nearly destroyed them. Trent had convinced my father to take out a massive home equity line of credit on their suburban mansion to fund his new cryptocurrency startup. My father, desperate to impress his new son-in-law and secure a piece of this imaginary digital fortune, agreed without consulting a real financial advisor. When the crypto market tanked and Trent's startup dissolved into thin air, the bank came calling for the money. My parents were secretly facing immediate foreclosure. For a prominent church deacon and his socialite wife, losing their home to the bank would have been a social death sentence. It would have ruined them in front of the entire congregation. They never asked me for help because they did not think I had the money, but I found out through my professional network that their property was moving into distressed status. I could not let them end up on the street, no matter how poorly they treated me. So I used a blind LLC, a subsidiary of my company, Vanguard Holdings, to purchase the debt directly from the bank. I became their shadow landlord. I restructured the loan, entirely dropping the interest rate to zero and heavily subsidizing their monthly payments out of my own pocket so they could afford to stay in the house. My parents thought they had been granted a miraculous hardship modification from some faceless corporate entity. They never knew it was their unwanted daughter paying the bulk of their mortgage every single month. But Trent was greedy. In the weeks leading up to this anniversary dinner, Trent discovered that my parents were technically paying pennies on a multi-million-dollar property. Believing he had found a massive corporate oversight, he convinced my terrified father to transfer the deed of the house over to him and Chloe. Trent told Calvin that by putting the house in his name, he could protect the asset from any future bank audits and secure the family legacy. Calvin, eager to trust the white tech bro over his own common sense, signed the paperwork. What Trent, the self-proclaimed business genius, failed to realize was that transferring the deed without the authorization of the lien holder triggered an immediate acceleration clause in the contract. By taking ownership of the deed, Trent legally assumed the entirety of the original massive debt at the current market interest rate. I looked at the Instagram post one more time. They were celebrating their wealth in a house I owned while explicitly telling the world I was not family. I tapped the comment icon under Chloe's photo. My fingers flew across the keyboard with absolute precision. Congrats, mortgage and taxes are all yours now. I hit post. I set the phone face down on my desk, took another sip of my bourbon, and waited. I counted the seconds, watching the city traffic crawl far below my window. 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. At exactly 7 minutes, my phone screen illuminated. I flipped it over and refreshed the app. The post was gone. Chloe had deleted it entirely. Immediately, the screen shifted to an incoming call from my mother. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. Then Chloe called. Then my father. Then Trent. Within 10 minutes, I had 40 missed calls and a flood of frantic text messages. I opened my voicemail app and tapped the newest message from Trent. His voice blared through the quiet office, no longer smug, but aggressively slurring from the champagne and rising panic. "You jealous bitch!" he screamed into the phone. "What the hell is wrong with you leaving a comment like that on Chloe's post? I negotiated that deed transfer directly with the bank today. You have nothing to do with this house. You are just a pathetic house flipper trying to ruin our night because you are single and miserable. Do not ever contact us again." I listened to his rant, the sheer unearned arrogance radiating from every word. He really thought he had outsmarted a faceless bank. He thought he had secured a free mansion to bolster his fake wealth portfolio. He thought I was just throwing a childish tantrum online out of jealousy. I opened my iPad and brought up the internal Vanguard Holdings property management system. There was the file for my parents' estate now officially registered under Trent and Chloe's names. Because the deed had been transferred, the hardship subsidy I had personally funded for 3 years was no longer applicable. The system was waiting for my final executive approval to generate the new billing statements. I selected the document reviewing the brutal numbers. The new monthly mortgage payment adjusted to the current market rate without my subsidy was $14,000. Furthermore, because Trent had triggered the transfer clause, the delayed property taxes that I had shielded my parents from were now due in full. $45,000 payable in exactly 15 days, or the property would enter immediate public auction. They wanted family only. They wanted elegant vibes without my aggressive independence. I picked up my digital pen and signed my name on the bottom of the screen, authorizing the immediate removal of the Vanguard subsidy. The system confirmed the action, sending an automated electronic notice directly to Trent's email address. I locked the iPad and took a deep breath, letting the silence of the penthouse settle around me once more. The burden of saving people who despised me was finally lifted from my shoulders. I poured myself one last drop of bourbon, ready to pack up and head home to my own quiet house. But the night was far from over. At exactly 11 o'clock, the private elevator indicator light above my office door illuminated. Only security and high-level personnel had access to this floor. The digital numbers ticked upward, steadily approaching the penthouse level. I did not move from my desk. I simply folded my hands and waited as the soft chime echoed through the reception area. The heavy glass doors slid open violently. Calvin, Evelyn, Chloe, and Trent stormed into my office lobby, bypassing the empty reception desk and marching straight toward my open door. They were still wearing their expensive evening wear from the country club, but the elegant vibe was completely gone. Chloe's mascara was slightly smudged. My mother's face was twisted into a mask of pure indignation. Calvin looked breathless and furious. Trent led the pack, his face flushed a deep, angry red, clutching his phone in his hand like a weapon. The war had arrived at my doorstep, and I was ready for it. The heavy glass doors of my private office lobby slid open with a violent hiss. The polished marble floors echoed with the sharp, frantic clicking of my mother's designer heels and the heavy thud of my father's dress shoes. They marched past the empty reception desk, ignoring the expensive artwork and the sleek, modern lines of the workspace I had built from nothing. I remained seated behind my mahogany desk, the crystal glass of aged bourbon resting loosely in my right hand. I did not stand to greet them. I did not offer a welcoming smile. I simply watched the chaos pour into my sanctuary. Calvin was the first to breach the doorway. He was still wearing his custom-tailored tuxedo, the very picture of the dignified church patriarch, but his face was a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The veins in his neck stood out, straining against his silk collar. Evelyn flanked him, her sequined evening gown glittering under the recessed lighting, her lips pressed into a tight, furious line. Chloe hovered just behind them, clutching a diamond-encrusted evening bag, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and indignation. And bringing up the rear was Trent. He smelled of expensive cigars and country club champagne, his face flushed a deep, angry red. "Delete that comment right now," my father roared, his booming voice designed to command congregations and intimidate sinners. It bounced off the high ceilings of my office, completely devoid of its usual holy warmth. "You are not going to embarrass us tonight, Maya. You are not going to ruin your sister's evening just because you are spiteful and cannot stand to see anyone else happy." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the silence stretch. I could see the confusion flickering in my father's eyes. He was used to me arguing back, defending myself, or shrinking under his booming reprimands. My absolute stillness unnerved him. Trent stepped around my father, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. He marched right up to the edge of my desk, slamming his palms down on the polished wood. "You really think you are something special, do you not?" He sneered, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "You sit up here in your little rented office playing boss and you think you can threaten me online." I spent the entire afternoon with real corporate lawyers, Maya. I negotiated a multi-million-dollar asset transfer directly with the bank. I secured this family's legacy. You are a glorified house flipper. You do not have the capital, the leverage, or the intelligence to touch me or that house. I looked at Trent's manicured hands resting on my desk, then shifted my gaze up to his flushed face. He was so deeply convinced of his own superiority, so certain that a black woman running a real estate business could never outsmart a white tech prodigy with a communications degree and a failed crypto startup. Before I could respond, my mother stepped forward, smoothing the front of her gown as if brushing away the sheer indignity of having to look at me. "Trent is absolutely right," she said, her voice sharp and perfectly modulated to inflict maximum psychological damage. "You are embarrassing yourself, Maya. You have always been bitter. Ever since you were a little girl, you wanted what your sister had, but you refused to be soft enough to get it. Look at you. You are nearly 40 years old, sitting alone in an empty office on a Saturday night, working yourself to the bone like a mule." She stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You resent Chloe because she understands her value. She found a provider, a brilliant man, who takes care of the big business, so she can focus on building a beautiful family. You chose this aggressive masculine independence, and now you are mad because you are lonely. Apologize to your brother-in-law immediately. Apologize for trying to ruin the celebration of our family legacy, and take that disgraceful comment down before the entire church board sees it." The silence that followed her monologue was thick and heavy. Chloe stood in the background, nodding along, wiping a singular, perfectly timed tear from her cheek, playing the fragile victim to absolute perfection. They stood there, a united front, a flawless portrait of suburban success, demanding that I bow my head and accept my place as the family scapegoat. I set my bourbon glass down on a leather coaster. The soft clink was the only sound in the room. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching the trap snap shut. "You think you secured the family legacy, Trent?" I asked, my voice quiet and perfectly calm. "You think you outmaneuvered the bank?" "I know I did," he shot back, crossing his arms over his chest. "The deed is officially registered to Chloe and me. We own the estate lock, stock, and barrel. You have zero authority here." I did not flinch. I reached out and pressed a small silver button embedded in the surface of my desk. Instantly, the massive smart glass wall behind me shifted from transparent to a solid opaque white. A hidden projector whirred to life, casting a massive high-resolution corporate organizational chart across the entire wall. It was a complex web of holding companies, blind trusts, and regional subsidiaries. Trent's eyes instinctively followed the glowing lines of the chart. He traced the subsidiary that held the mortgage on my parents' house, a company named Apex Financial Solutions. He followed the line, connecting Apex to a regional parent company, and then followed that line straight up to the very top of the pyramid. At the apex of the massive corporate structure in bold, unmissable lettering was the name Vanguard Holdings, and directly beneath that name was mine, Maya Vance, founder and chief executive officer. Trent stared at the wall, his arms slowly dropping to his sides. The arrogant sneer on his face dissolved into absolute blank confusion. Calvin and Evelyn turned to look at the chart, their eyes darting between my name on the wall and the woman sitting calmly behind the desk. "I am not a house flipper, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "I am Vanguard Holdings. I own Apex Financial. I own the debt on that house. I am the bank. I am your actual landlord." Trent's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. "That is impossible," he stammered, taking a step back from my desk. "I met with the executives. I met with senior directors at Apex, white guys in suits. They signed the paperwork. They approved the deed transfer." "You met with the asset managers I pay to handle low-level bureaucratic paperwork," I corrected him smoothly. "You met with the men I hired to smile and nod while arrogant little boys sign their lives away. They did exactly what I instructed them to do. They let you take the bait." I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick leather-bound legal portfolio. I dropped it onto the center of the desk with a heavy, resounding thud. I opened the cover and slid the updated amortization schedule across the wood so it stopped right at Trent's fingertips. "Let me explain exactly what you did today while you were busy playing the family savior," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the desk. 3 years ago, my parents were 90 days away from total foreclosure because my father took out a massive home equity line of credit to fund your imaginary crypto company. To save them from public humiliation at their precious megachurch, I bought their debt. I quietly absorbed the loan into Vanguard Holdings. For 36 months, I have personally subsidized the interest and paid the bulk of the principal so they could pretend they were still wealthy. They were paying pennies on the dollar because I allowed it. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at Calvin and Evelyn. They refused to meet her eyes, staring at the floor in profound shame. "But you, Trent," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his pale face. "You triggered a transfer of ownership. You convinced my father to sign the deed over to you. And in doing so, you violated the strict terms of the hardship modification I had privately authorized. By taking legal ownership of the property without the direct consent of the primary lien holder, which is me, you triggered the acceleration clause." Trent stared at the papers, his eyes darting frantically across the columns of numbers. He was finally doing the math. "The family subsidy is legally void." I stated, my tone clinical and detached. "The grace period is over. As the new legal owner of the property, you have assumed the entirety of the original debt at the current aggressive market interest rate. Your new monthly mortgage payment is exactly $14,622. Chloe let out a sharp, strangled cry. Her designer clutch slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble floor. 14,000, she gasped, grabbing Trent's arm. "Trent, tell me she is lying. Tell me we do not owe that." "I am not finished," I said, cutting through Chloe's panic. "Because you initiated an unauthorized transfer, the property tax shield is also dissolved. The back taxes that I have been privately deferring for 3 years are now fully your responsibility. You owe $45,000 to the county, and because of the acceleration clause, that amount is due in exactly 15 days. If the balance is not paid in full by certified cashier check, the property goes to public auction, and you will be immediately evicted." The room descended into a terrifying, suffocating silence. The reality of their financial devastation crashed over them, stripping away every ounce of their country club superiority. Chloe was hyperventilating, clinging to Trent's jacket, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Evelyn stood completely paralyzed, her mouth slightly open, the illusion of her perfect life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Calvin, however, could not handle the humiliation. His shame rapidly, violently morphed into defensive fury. His face turned a deep, mottled purple, and he lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You set us up!" he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You waited in the shadows like a coward, and you set a trap for your own flesh and blood. You purposely let him sign those papers just to destroy us. You are a monster, Maya. A cold, heartless monster trying to ruin your family out of pure spite." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. "You handed the keys to your home to a con artist, Dad," I replied, my voice unwavering. "I just stopped paying the bill. If facing the actual consequences of your own financial decisions ruins you, then you were ruined a long time ago." Trent, who had been staring at the legal documents in absolute shock, suddenly tore his eyes away. The panic on his face hardened, mutating back into the desperate, cornered aggression of a narcissist who refuses to lose. He snatched the papers off my desk and crumpled them in his fist. "You think you are so smart?" he sneered, stepping back toward Chloe and my parents. "You think you tied this up in a neat little bow. But you made a mistake, Maya. You left a paper trail a mile long when you transferred those subsidies." He pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it up like a shield. "I have the best aggressive litigation team in Atlanta on retainer. They already looked into your little LLC structure, just in case the bank tried to pull something. They found a loophole in how you shielded those assets. I am going to tie Vanguard Holdings up in so much litigation you will not be able to breathe. I am going to sue you for fraudulent lending practices, and I am going to rip this entire company right out of your hands." He smiled a vicious, ugly twisting of his lips, believing with every fiber of his being that his white shoe lawyers could crush my empire. "You messed with the wrong guy," he whispered. "I am going to take everything you have." Trent's threat hung in the air of the penthouse office, a desperate attempt to regain control. He let out a harsh, mocking scoff, shaking his head, as if the very idea of me holding power over him was a hilarious joke. He leaned over my mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as he pressed his weight onto the polished wood. "You think a cheap parlor trick changes anything?" Trent demanded. "You are a glorified house flipper, Maya. You buy trashed properties in bad zip codes and slap cheap paint on the walls. I dealt with Apex Financial Solutions. They are a massive corporate entity. You probably just bought a minor stake in some shell company and think you can push us around. I know real corporate acquisition. I am not scared of you." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick leather-bound legal portfolio. I dropped it onto the center of the desk with a heavy, resounding thud. I flipped open the cover and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the smooth surface until it stopped right at Trent's fingertips. "I am not a shareholder, Trent," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his flushed face. "I am the sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings. I own Apex Financial entirely, and as of 3 years ago, I own the debt on the mansion you just tried to steal. You did not outsmart a faceless corporation. You walked blindly into my house and signed your own financial death warrant." Trent snatched the paper off the desk. It was the updated amortization schedule for the property. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the columns of numbers, his arrogant sneer faltering as the mathematical reality of his situation began to set in. "Let me explain real estate law to you, since your tech background clearly left gaps in your education." I continued, my tone clinical and detached. "When my father secretly took out a massive home equity line of credit to fund your imaginary crypto startup, he defaulted. The bank was 90 days away from kicking him and my mother out onto the street. To save them from public humiliation at their precious megachurch, I bought that debt through my subsidiary. For 36 months, I have personally subsidized the interest and paid the bulk of the principal out of my own pocket. They were paying pennies on the dollar because I allowed it. I paid for the roof over your head." Chloe gasped a sharp, ragged sound. Her hands flew to her mouth and she looked at our parents in absolute horror. Calvin and Evelyn refused to meet her eyes, staring at the floor in profound, humiliating shame. The illusion of their generational wealth was shattering right in front of their golden son-in-law. "But you got greedy, Trent," I said, leaning forward. "You found out they were paying a fraction of the market rate, and you thought you discovered a bank error. You convinced my terrified father to transfer the deed of the house into your name and Chloe's name, thinking you were securing a multi-million-dollar asset for free. But you failed to read the fine print." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the document in his trembling hand. "By executing a quitclaim deed transfer without obtaining explicit written authorization from the primary lien holder, which is me, you violated the strict terms of the hardship modification. You triggered the acceleration clause. The family subsidy is legally void. The grace period is over." Trent swallowed hard, the paper shaking in his grip. Chloe grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his expensive tuxedo jacket. "Trent, what does it say?" Chloe begged, her voice pitching upward into a frantic whine. "Trent, tell me what she means." "It means your lavish lifestyle is a mirage." "Chloe," I answered for him, "as the new legal owners of the property, you and your husband have officially assumed the entirety of the original debt at the current aggressive market interest rate. Your new monthly mortgage payment is exactly $14,000, and it is due on the 1st of every single month." Chloe let out a strangled cry, her knees buckling slightly. Evelyn rushed forward to catch her golden child, wrapping her arms around Chloe's trembling shoulders. 14,000! Chloe sobbed, hyperventilating as the panic took full control of her body. "We cannot afford that. Trent, you said the house was paid off. You said we were set for life. Tell her we cannot pay that. I am not finished, I said, slicing through Chloe's hysterics. Because Trent initiated an unauthorized transfer. The property tax shield is also permanently dissolved. The back taxes that I have been privately deferring to save our parents from bankruptcy are now fully your responsibility. You owe $45,000 to the county. And because of the acceleration clause, that amount is due in exactly 15 days. If the balance is not paid in full by a certified cashier check, the property goes to immediate public auction, and you will be evicted by the sheriff's department. The penthouse office descended into a terrifying, suffocating silence. The ambient noise of the city traffic below seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of Chloe's ragged, desperate breathing. The reality of their financial devastation had completely stripped away their country club superiority. They had walked into my office demanding an apology for an internet comment, and now they were staring down the barrel of absolute ruin. Evelyn looked up at me, her face pale, her usual perfect composure completely destroyed. "Maya, you have to reverse this," she demanded, though her voice lacked its usual venom. It sounded thin and desperate. "You cannot do this to your sister. She just got married. You have to fix the paperwork. Tell the company it was a mistake." "There is no mistake, Mother," I replied flatly. "Trent signed the legal documents. The system has already processed the transfer. The billing statements have been generated and issued." That was when Calvin finally snapped. He could not handle the crushing weight of his own humiliation. His shame rapidly and violently morphed into defensive fury. His face turned a deep mottled purple, and he lunged forward, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly at my face. "You set us up," my father roared, his voice trembling with rage. "You waited in the shadows like a coward, and you set a trap for your own flesh and blood. You knew Trent was filing that paperwork, and you purposely let him do it just to destroy us. You are a monster, Maya. A cold, heartless monster trying to render your own parents homeless out of pure spite." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible and inadequate. He was a church deacon, a man who preached accountability every Sunday, yet he stood in my office blaming me for the consequences of his own secret financial failures. "You handed the keys to your home to a con artist, Dad," I replied, my voice completely unwavering. "I just stopped paying your bills. If facing the actual consequences of your own financial decisions ruins you, then you were ruined a long time ago." Trent, who had been staring at the legal documents in absolute shock, suddenly tore his eyes away. The sheer panic on his face hardened, mutating back into the desperate, cornered aggression of a narcissist who absolutely refuses to lose. He crushed the amortization schedule in his fist and threw it onto the floor of my office. Instead of apologizing, instead of begging for a payment plan, or acknowledging the massive grace I had shown his in-laws for 3 years, Trent sneered. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone, holding it up as if it were a weapon. "You think you are untouchable because your name is on a piece of paper?" Trent spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think a cheap technicality is going to ruin me? I have the best aggressive litigation team in Atlanta on speed dial. They handle real corporate law, not this bottom-feeding debt collection garbage you do." He took a step closer, pointing his finger at me. "You set a predatory trap for an elderly couple and transferred their debt under false pretenses. I have a legal loophole that will rip this little company right out of your hands. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years until you are bankrupt and begging us for a place to stay." The morning sun beat down on the sprawling asphalt parking lot of Greater Grace Fellowship. This was not merely a place of worship. It was an Atlanta institution, a massive megachurch where lucrative business deals were quietly closed in the vestibule and rigid social hierarchies were cemented in the front pews. My father, Calvin, had been a prominent deacon here for 2 decades. It was the absolute epicenter of my family's carefully curated public image. I pulled my car into my usual spot and took a deep, steadying breath. I wore a tailored emerald green dress, and carrying myself with the exact same unshakable poise I had maintained during the confrontation in my office the night before. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I knew my mother Evelyn and my sister Chloe would not simply accept their financial ruin quietly. But the moment my heels touched the polished marble of the main church lobby, I realized I had underestimated their capacity for vindictive manipulation. I immediately felt the temperature in the room drop. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. Usually, Sister Thomas, the head of the usher board, would greet me with a warm, enthusiastic hug and a printed Sunday bulletin. Today, she looked right through me, pivoting sharply on her heel to hand a program to the family walking in behind me. Her face was set in stone. As I walked down the long central aisle, the whispers rose around me like a swarm of agitated locusts. I saw heads tilting together. I saw the deeply judgmental side eyes from the deaconesses in their Sunday hats. I saw the sudden silence that fell over small groups of congregants as I passed their pews. I kept my gaze forward, scanning the massive sanctuary. My father Calvin was already seated in the designated deacon box up on the main stage, looking incredibly solemn and victimized. Down in the second row, the prime real estate of the sanctuary, sat my mother Evelyn, alongside Chloe and Trent. Chloe was putting on the performance of an absolute lifetime. She was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, leaning heavily against Trent's shoulder. Trent looked stoic and protective, wrapping his arm around his supposedly fragile wife. Evelyn was rubbing Chloe's back, whispering comforting words while simultaneously making sure every prominent church member in their vicinity saw their extreme distress. I took a seat a few rows behind them, watching the theatrical display unfold with clinical detachment. The narrative they had spun was blatantly obvious. Evelyn and Chloe had not slept a wink. They had spent the entire night working the phones, calling the prayer warriors, the church elders, and the gossiping socialites. They had spun a vicious, entirely fabricated story to the congregation. They painted me not as the silent savior who had secretly paid their mortgage for 3 long years, but as a ruthless, predatory lender. The spin was mathematically perfect for this crowd. Maya, the bitter, miserable single older sister, was using her corporate wealth to punish her sweet newlywed sister. I was the jealous spinster trying to render my own aging parents homeless out of pure, unadulterated spite because I could not find a man of my own. I watched a few older women lean over the pews to offer Chloe tissues, throwing glares filled with righteous indignation in my direction. Then the service began, and the psychological warfare escalated. Pastor Davis, a charismatic man with a booming voice and a penchant for dramatic delivery, took the pulpit. His sermon was entirely too pointed to be a coincidence. He paced across the stage, preaching passionately about the terrible dangers of greed. He spoke about family members who turn their backs on their own flesh and blood for the love of money. He raised his voice to the vaulted ceiling, speaking about the sacred holy duty to honor thy mother and thy father. He warned the congregation about how modern corporate society breeds cold, heartless women, devoid of Christian charity and family loyalty. Every time he emphasized a point, dozens of eyes in the congregation darted toward my seat. Up on the stage, Calvin sat nodding solemnly, playing the persecuted patriarch to absolute perfection, wiping a singular fake tear from his eye. They thought this would break me. They thought bringing the weight of the entire church community down on my shoulders would force me to submit. They weaponized their faith and their social standing, assuming that public humiliation would make me surrender my company and my assets just to regain their approval. I did not shrink into my seat. I sat up straighter, crossing my legs and maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with Pastor Davis until he was the one who had to look away and clear his throat. The service finally concluded with an extended dramatic altar call, during which Chloe openly wept, clinging to Trent's jacket, as if she were about to be thrown into the streets that very afternoon. I stood up calmly, gathering my purse, preparing to walk out of the sanctuary and leave them to their delusions. Before I could reach the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church, Brother Miller, a senior usher, stepped directly into my path. He did not smile. His face was grave, and he kept his voice low, almost conspiratorial, as if speaking to a criminal. "Pastor Davis would like a word with you in his private study." "Maya," he said, gesturing toward the back administrative hallway. He said it is urgent. I nodded once, completely unfazed, and followed Brother Miller through the labyrinth of quiet, carpeted hallways, away from the loud chatter of the departing congregation. The pastor's private study was plush and intimidating, lined with heavy theological texts and framed photographs of local politicians. Pastor Davis was sitting behind his massive oak desk, wearing his clerical robes. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured disappointment, the kind reserved for the most grievous of sinners. But what caught my immediate attention was not his disapproving stare. It was the document resting dead center on his desk. It was printed on heavy premium legal paper. Even from a few feet away, I could clearly recognize the distinctive letterhead of Trent's aggressive downtown litigation firm. Pastor Davis steepled his fingers, sighed heavily, and pushed the legal document across the polished wood toward me. He looked me in the eye and told me that this was a forgiveness waiver drafted early this morning by Trent's lawyers. He explained that my family was willing to forgive my terrible transgressions and protect my reputation in the church. All I had to do to restore my soul and save my family from ruin was sign the bottom line, formally transferring the multi-million-dollar property and all associated Vanguard Holdings debt entirely over to Trent. I stared at the heavy cream paper sitting on the polished oak of Pastor Davis' desk. The sheer audacity of the document was almost breathtaking. Trent and my father had actually convinced a man of the cloth to act as their corporate debt collector under the guise of spiritual intervention. Maya, you have a profound opportunity today. The pastor began, his voice taking on that gentle, practiced cadence he used during counseling sessions. You can heal the breach in your family. The scripture is clear on this matter. We must honor our mother and father so that our days may be long upon the earth. By signing this waiver, you are not losing an asset. You are gaining back your family. You are demonstrating the grace and forgiveness that this church stands for. I did not touch the pen he offered. I looked from the legal document up to his expectant face. You want me to honor my father by handing a multi-million-dollar property and a highly leveraged corporate asset over to a man who tried to illegally transfer a deed to avoid paying his debts? I asked, my voice perfectly flat. You call that grace, Pastor. I call it fraud. And I do not mix my corporate holdings with your twisted theology. Before Pastor Davis could launch into another sermon, the heavy oak door of the study swung open. My mother Evelyn marched into the room, completely disregarding church etiquette. She must have been pacing the hallway, unable to relinquish control of the situation. Her eyes darted from the unsigned document to my face, and her features hardened into a mask of absolute contempt. I knew you would be stubborn, Evelyn hissed, stepping up to the desk. You have always been completely incapable of seeing the bigger picture. We are offering you a chance to make things right, to step back into the fold, and you are sitting here arguing over money. You have never sacrificed a single thing for this family, Maya. You take and you hoard and you hold grudges while your sister gives everything she has to keep this family united. The word sacrifice hung in the air between us. It was the exact trigger I needed to finally shatter the illusion she had hidden behind for 15 years. I stood up from the leather guest chair, leaning across the pastor's desk, until I was eye to eye with my mother. Never sacrificed a single thing, I repeated softly, the quietness of my tone causing Pastor Davis to shift uncomfortably in his seat. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and unlocked it. I opened my secure banking application, navigating to a very specific archived file I had kept meticulously preserved since I was 20 years old. I turned the screen around and slammed the phone face up onto the waiver. Look at it, I demanded. Look at the date and look at the amount. Evelyn glanced down, and the color immediately drained from her face. Pastor Davis leaned forward, peering at the screen. It was a digital scan of a cashed cashier check. $60,000. When I was 20 years old, I worked 3 jobs to build my college savings fund. I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. I saved $60,000 to pay for my master's degree in real estate finance. And 1 week before my tuition was due, that entire account was emptied. Pastor Davis looked at my mother, his pastoral mask slipping into genuine confusion. Evelyn, what is she talking about? I will tell you exactly what she is talking about. I said, refusing to let my mother look away. Chloe wanted a lavish destination wedding in Santorini. She wanted private villas and custom floral arrangements that cost more than a luxury car. She did not have the money, and neither did you. So Chloe walked into the bank with a forged signature and emptied my college fund. Evelyn swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the desk. That was a misunderstanding, she stammered, her voice losing its previous venom. We intended to pay you back. It was a family investment. A family investment? I laughed, a harsh, sharp sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. That is exactly what Dad called it when I came home crying. He sat me down and told me that Chloe needed her special day to secure her future with her first husband. He told me to take out high-interest student loans because family comes first, and I had to sacrifice for the greater good. You stole my future to pay for a party, Evelyn. And when that marriage fell apart 2 years later, you expected me to feel sorry for her. I snatched my phone off the desk. You talk about me hoarding my wealth. You talk about me holding grudges. I built my empire despite you stealing my foundation. I paid off those loans while you bought designer shoes. And then when you were about to lose your house because of Trent's reckless greed, I still stepped in and saved you. I subsidized your life for 3 years while you paraded around this church pretending to be untouchable. And your response was to try and steal from me again. Maya, please, Pastor Davis interjected, raising his hands in a placating gesture. These are deep wounds, but holding on to this anger will only destroy your spirit. If you just sign the property over, we can begin the healing process. We can arrange family counseling. I looked at the pastor, a man so desperate to maintain the pristine image of his top donors that he was willing to facilitate a financial shakedown. I reached down and picked up the thick, cream-colored waiver. I held it up between both hands. There will be no healing, I said, looking directly at Evelyn. There will be no counseling, and there will certainly be no signature. With one sharp, violent motion, I ripped the legal document straight down the middle. The sound of tearing heavy paper sliced through the heavy silence of the study. I placed the 2 torn halves neatly back onto the center of the pastor's desk. You wanted family only, I said, quoting the Instagram caption that had started this entire war. Well, you got it. You and Calvin and Chloe and Trent, you all deserve exactly what you have coming to you. And Pastor, you can keep your twisted theology. I am officially withdrawing my membership from this church. I turned my back on my mother and the pastor and walked out of the study. I strode down the long carpeted hallway, my heels clicking with the steady rhythm of absolute liberation. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church and stepped out into the blinding Atlanta sunlight. The humid air hit my face, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, entirely free. I had shed the toxic social circle, the suffocating religious guilt, and the familial obligations that had kept me chained to their dysfunction. I walked across the sprawling asphalt parking lot toward my car. The lot was mostly empty now, the congregation having dispersed to their Sunday brunches and afternoon naps. I pulled my keys from my purse, pressing the unlock button. As I approached the driver's side, my step faltered. There was a thick manila envelope tucked firmly under the windshield wiper of my car. It was secured with a piece of heavy packing tape flapping slightly in the warm breeze. My instincts instantly flared. This was not a flyer or a forgotten bulletin. I reached out and ripped the envelope free. The front was blank, but it carried the distinct heavy weight of official legal correspondence. I tore the flap open and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. The bold black text at the very top of the first page hit me like a physical blow. It was a formal summons to the Fulton County Superior Court. I scanned the plaintiff line, Calvin Preston and Trent Blackwood. I read further, dropping down to the official charges listed in bold typography. They were officially suing me for fraudulent transfer of assets and elder abuse. I stared at the words, my mind racing to process the sheer audacity of the claim. Trent had not been bluffing in my office. He had actually found a lawyer vicious enough and unethical enough to spin my secret financial rescue into a malicious predatory attack on a vulnerable senior citizen. They were claiming I had manipulated Calvin into an illegal mortgage trap using my professional expertise to confuse him during a moment of financial distress. The elder abuse charge was a calculated tactical strike meant to ruin my standing in the real estate community and trigger an immediate injunction against my businesses. They were going to try and drag Vanguard Holdings into a grueling public trial and destroy everything I had built using the very sympathy of the court against me. I could picture Trent sitting in that downtown law office laughing as he painted himself as the brave son-in-law trying to rescue my parents from my predatory corporate grip. I threw the summons onto the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel, gripping the leather tightly. My heart pounded a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. The war was no longer confined to country clubs and church offices. They had taken it to the legal system, and they had absolutely no idea what kind of monster they had just woken up. 2 weeks later, the sterile chill of the downtown litigation boardroom stood in stark contrast to the humid Atlanta heat outside. I sat perfectly still in a high-backed leather chair staring across the long expanse of polished mahogany. Beside me sat Jordan, my lead corporate counsel. Jordan was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who communicated entirely in billable hours and ruthless efficiency. I paid him exceptionally well to be completely devoid of emotion, and today I needed his icy detachment more than ever. Across the wide table sat the opposition. Trent looked unbearably smug, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest, like a man who had already won the war. Chloe sat next to him, dabbing at her perfectly powdered nose, with a tissue playing the role of the distressed, delicate wife. Calvin sat rigid, staring straight ahead, while Evelyn glared at me with an intensity that could melt glass. And then there was Trent's lawyer, a loud-mouthed, aggressively tanned man named Marcus Thorne, who looked like he belonged on a billboard for personal injury claims, rather than a high-stakes corporate mediation. The deposition was officially on the record, the red light of the recording device blinking steadily in the center of the table. Thorne did not waste a single second. He immediately launched into a theatrical display of aggressive questioning, designed specifically to rattle me and paint a completely fabricated narrative for the court reporter. He paced the length of the room, pointing his gold pen at me like a weapon. He attempted to paint a picture of me, not as a highly successful chief executive officer, but as a bitter, aging spinster who had spent years obsessing over her younger sister's perfect life. He claimed I was emotionally unstable, driven by deep-seated jealousy and a vindictive desire to ruin the family dynamic simply because I could not secure a husband of my own. According to Thorne's ridiculous and deeply insulting narrative, Trent was a visionary tech genius who simply fell victim to a highly coordinated predatory lending trap set by a jealous, lonely woman. He twisted the facts, claiming I had intentionally disguised my identity within Vanguard Holdings just to lure Trent into signing that deed transfer. Thorne practically shouted that I had weaponized my corporate resources to commit blatant elder abuse against my own aging parents. He repeatedly used words like malicious, predatory, and hysterical, trying to bait me into raising my voice or showing anger. He wanted me to act like the angry black woman they had always accused me of being, so he could have it captured on the official transcript. I simply sat there, my face a mask of absolute calm, refusing to give him a single ounce of the reaction he was so desperately seeking. Seeing that Thorne's aggressive tactics were not breaking my composure, Chloe decided it was her turn to perform. Right on cue, she let out a loud, tragic sob. She reached across the table, grabbing Trent's hand and burying her face in his shoulder. She looked directly at the court reporter, ensuring her tears were duly noted for the official record. She spoke in a trembling, fragile voice about the severe emotional distress I was causing their new marriage. She claimed Trent was a sensitive, creative genius whose brilliant mind was completely paralyzed by the anxiety of this malicious lawsuit. She painted her husband not as the arrogant grifter who tried to steal our parents' house, but as a fragile victim of my supposed corporate bullying. She sobbed about how they had been looking forward to building a family in that house, to carrying on the church legacy, and how my aggressive masculine bitterness had shattered their dream. She told the room that I had always hated Trent because he was a real man, a provider who exposed my own failures as a woman. It was a masterclass in gaslighting and manipulation, taking every toxic talking point my mother had ever used against me and weaponizing it for a legal deposition. Trent patted her back, looking at me with a triumphant smirk, clearly believing that this emotional display would somehow override the binding legal contracts he had blindly signed. I did not break my neutral expression. I did not defend my femininity or my relationship status. I simply turned my head and looked at Jordan. Jordan leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and completely dismantled Thorne's theatrical performance with a few sharp surgical sentences. He reminded Thorne that this was a corporate deposition regarding commercial real estate law, not an audition for a daytime soap opera. Jordan smoothly placed the signed quitclaim deed and the acceleration clause documents onto the center of the table, pointing out that Trent's signature was clearly visible on every single page. He noted for the record that Trent had actively presented himself as a savvy financial investor during the deed transfer, and therefore could not retroactively claim to be a naive, vulnerable victim just because he failed to read the standard fine print of a commercial loan assumption. Jordan made it exceptionally clear that emotional distress was not a valid legal defense for defaulting on a multi-million-dollar acceleration clause. Furthermore, Jordan produced the email chain where Trent aggressively negotiated with the Apex financial representatives, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Trent initiated the transfer entirely of his own volition out of pure greed. Jordan looked at Thorne with absolute deadpan precision and suggested that if Trent's brilliant tech mind was too fragile to understand basic real estate contracts, perhaps he should seek a legal guardian rather than a lawyer. Thorne scowled, his aggressive tactics momentarily stalled by Jordan's icy, irrefutable logic. His face flushed a dark red beneath his artificial tan. Realizing that the emotional manipulation angle was failing miserably, Thorne pivoted to his trump card. He called my father to give his official statement on the record. Calvin sat up straight, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He placed his hands flat on the table, looking the very picture of a respectable, honest church deacon. The court reporter reminded him he was speaking under penalty of perjury. I watched my father, waiting to see if there was any shred of integrity left in the man who had raised me. I waited to see if his faith or his conscience would prevent him from crossing the ultimate line. Calvin turned his head and looked me dead in the eye. His gaze was entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. It was cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. He spoke with the clear, booming cadence he used at the pulpit, projecting total authority. He stated for the official record that he had absolutely no idea I owned Apex Financial or Vanguard Holdings. That was a lie, but it was not the worst of it. Calvin did not stop there. He leaned closer to the microphone and stated under oath that 3 years ago I was the one who intentionally deceived him into taking out the original disastrous home equity line of credit. He claimed with a straight face that I had secretly advised him to fund Trent's crypto startup, specifically knowing the venture would fail. He testified that I orchestrated the entire collapse so that I could eventually swoop in, buy the distressed debt through a shell company, and seize his beloved family home out of pure greed and spite. He claimed I had manipulated him when he was medically vulnerable, feeding him false financial advice to steal the estate. He committed perjury right to my face. He rewrote our entire family history to frame me as the evil architect of his own foolish greed, protecting Trent and sacrificing me without a single second of hesitation. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, save for the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys capturing every single perjured syllable. I sat perfectly still, watching my father breathe heavily. His chest puffed out with the self-righteous indignation of a man who fully believed his own fabricated martyrdom. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let him dig the grave as deep as he possibly could. Trent was practically glowing, exchanging a victorious look with Thorne across the polished mahogany. Evelyn gave my father an approving nod, while Chloe sniffled into her tissue, playing the distressed daughter to absolute perfection. They thought they had me. They thought cornering me in a legal setting with a sworn testimony would force me to surrender Vanguard Holdings to save my reputation. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the battlefield they had just stepped onto. Jordan let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds, ensuring the finality of Calvin's statement settled heavily into the official record. He did not object. He did not look angry. He simply reached into his sleek leather briefcase with the calm precision of a surgeon reaching for a scalpel. He did not pull out a defense. He pulled out a trap. Jordan placed a single, meticulously preserved document onto the table and slid it precisely to the center. It was the original home equity line of credit application from 3 years ago. Mr. Preston, Jordan began, his voice devoid of any inflection. You have just testified under oath that my client Maya intentionally deceived you into taking out this specific loan. You stated she orchestrated this entire financial maneuver. I want to be absolutely clear for the record. Are you stating that you signed this document based solely on her fraudulent advice? Calvin scoffed, rolling his eyes at the perceived redundancy. I absolutely am, he declared, his voice booming with pastoral authority. She told me it was a guaranteed investment. She used her fancy corporate language to confuse me and her mother. We trusted her. And this investment, Jordan continued, completely ignoring the emotional outburst. This was specifically for your son-in-law Trent's cryptocurrency startup, is that correct? Yes, Calvin snapped. Trent had a brilliant idea, a revolutionary algorithm. He just needed the seed money for servers and developers. Maya knew that, and she manipulated the situation to steal my home when the market fluctuated. Thorne leaned back, crossing his arms and grinning. I think my client has made himself perfectly clear, Counselor Thorne interrupted loudly. You can try to badger him all you want, but the truth is on the record. Your client is a predatory lender who abused her own parents. Jordan did not even look at Thorne. He kept his steely gaze fixed entirely on my father. He asked Calvin to look at the document in the center of the table. He asked him to confirm his signature on the bottom of page 4. Calvin leaned forward, glanced at the blue ink, and confirmed it with an impatient wave of his hand. He proudly stated that he signed it, reiterated that it was my malicious advice that drove him to do it, and loudly proclaimed his victimhood once more. Thank you, Mr. Preston, Jordan said quietly. You have been very helpful. Jordan opened his briefcase a second time. He produced a much thicker item. It was a sealed dossier bound in heavy cardstock and stamped with the silver crest of a premier international financial forensics firm. He placed it directly next to the HELOC document. Thorne's arrogant grin faltered. His eyes darted to the crest on the folder. As a defense attorney, he knew exactly what that logo meant. It was the mark of a firm that specialized in uncovering international wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. When Vanguard Holdings acquires distressed corporate debt, Jordan explained, his voice dropping to a low, icy register, we do not simply buy the paper. We buy the entire financial history. We execute a complete forensic audit of the originating accounts to ensure total regulatory compliance. We track every single cent from the moment of disbursement to its final destination. This was my moment. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished wood, and locked eyes with Trent. The smugness on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a creeping, ashen pallor. He suddenly looked like a man who realized the ground beneath his feet was made of thin ice. Buying your debt was not just a business transaction, Trent, I said, my voice slicing through the tension in the room. It was a forensic investigation. I slid the sealed dossier across the table until it rested directly in front of Thorne. I told him to open it. Thorne hesitated, his aggressively tanned face suddenly looking pale and slick with sweat. He looked at Trent and then back at the folder. He did not touch it. Trent shifted violently in his chair. This is a violation of privacy, he stammered, his voice pitching up an octave. You have no right to look into my business accounts. That is corporate espionage. You made it a matter of public record the second you filed a fraudulent lawsuit against my company, I replied smoothly. And you gave us the legal authorization when you signed the quitclaim deed transferring the debt obligations. We own the paper, Trent, which means we own the truth. I did not wait for Thorne to open the folder. I delivered the facts myself, reciting the financial timeline from memory. My father just testified under oath that the $200,000 HELOC was explicitly intended to fund your revolutionary cryptocurrency startup, I said, keeping my gaze fixed on Trent. He testified that you needed the money for developers and servers. He committed perjury to protect you because he genuinely believes your lies. But the forensic audit tells a completely different story. Chloe stopped crying. She lowered her tissue, looking at her husband with genuine confusion. Trent, what is she talking about? Chloe asked, her voice trembling without any theatrical enhancement. I will tell you exactly what I'm talking about, Chloe, I said, refusing to let Trent look away from me. There was never a crypto startup. There was no revolutionary algorithm. There were no venture capitalist meetings. Your husband did not lose my father's home equity in a volatile tech market. Evelyn slammed her hand on the table. Stop lying, Maya, she demanded, but her voice lacked its usual commanding force. We saw the business plans. We saw the pitch deck. You saw a customized PDF downloaded from the internet, Evelyn, I shot back. I laid out the exact forensic trail. Within 48 hours of Calvin depositing the $200,000 of home equity into Trent's supposed business account, $190,000 was immediately wire transferred out. I watched Trent swallow hard, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. It was not transferred to a software development firm. I continued, the words falling like hammer strikes. It was wired to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. From there, the money was dispersed into 3 separate offshore accounts within 24 hours. Thorne frantically grabbed the dossier, tearing the seal open and flipping through the pages. His eyes scanned the highlighted bank statements and wire transfer receipts. The color drained completely from the lawyer's face as he realized his client had lied to him and led him into a massive, unwinnable fraud case. Calvin stared at me, his pastoral mask finally slipping. What offshore accounts? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Where did the money go, Maya? It did not go into a tech company, Dad, I said, the satisfaction tasting sweet and cold on my tongue. It went directly to a series of high-stakes illegal sports betting syndicates. The room erupted into absolute chaos, but my voice cut through the noise with chilling clarity. He used your house to pay off massive spiraling illegal gambling debts, I stated loudly, ensuring the court reporter caught every single word. He was drowning in debts to underground bookies. He bet on offshore sports books, unregulated poker tournaments, and international fixtures. He lost every single cent of your equity paying off men who were threatening to break his legs. Trent did not invest your money. He gambled your home away on a football game, and he let you sit here and commit perjury to cover his tracks. Trent shot out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. Turn the recorder off, he yelled, waving his arms frantically at the court reporter. Turn it off right now. This is a setup. Thorne grabbed Trent's arm, pulling him down. Shut your mouth! Trent! Thorne hissed, his professional demeanor entirely shattered. Do not say another word on the record. Chloe looked at her husband, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. The fake tears were gone, replaced by genuine hyperventilation. She gripped the edge of the table, staring at the forensic documents scattered across the mahogany. You gambled it, she choked out. You told me it was a tech crash. You told me we were victims of the market. Evelyn sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The narrative she had spent years cultivating, the perfect son-in-law, the victimized family, the evil corporate daughter, had just been vaporized by irrefutable bank statements. Calvin looked down at his own hands, as if he no longer recognized them. He had just sworn under oath that I had orchestrated a financial collapse. He had committed a felony to protect a man who had used his life savings as a poker chip. The realization of his own foolishness, his own arrogance, and his own legal jeopardy settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Jordan calmly reached forward and tapped the microphone in the center of the table. Let the record show, Jordan said smoothly, that the plaintiff has been presented with forensic evidence of wire fraud and illegal gambling operations funded directly by the loan in question. Let the record also show that Mr. Preston has previously provided sworn testimony directly contradicting these financial realities. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my legs and watching the absolute devastation unfold across the table. They had wanted a legal battlefield. They had brought me into this room to destroy me, but they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to bury them all. The silence in the room stretched until it finally snapped under the weight of a sudden heavy thud. Chloe's quilted designer bag slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the commercial carpet. She did not reach down to pick it up. Her face was entirely drained of color, transforming her perfectly contoured features into a mask of chalky disbelief. She stared at Trent, as if a complete stranger had just materialized in the chair next to her. The lavish lifestyle, the expensive dinners, the perfectly curated Instagram posts about their blessed marriage were all instantly vaporized. She was realizing in real time that her entire fairy tale was funded by stolen family equity and degenerate sports betting. "Trent, you told me the market crashed," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "You swore to me that the developers took the money and ran. You looked me in the eyes and promised we were going to recover the funds." Trent did not even look at her. He simply shrugged off the hand she had placed on his arm, his charming, attentive husband persona dissolving into thin air. Calvin was faring much worse. The proud, booming patriarch of Greater Grace Fellowship was actively hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically and his hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were stark white. He was staring at the forensic dossier as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The devastating reality was crashing down on him. His golden son-in-law, the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, had played him for an absolute fool. Calvin had handed over the keys to his kingdom, and Trent had tossed them onto a roulette table. Evelyn sat frozen beside him, completely paralyzed. For a woman who thrived on controlling the narrative, she was entirely mute. There was no spin she could apply to this. There was no church gossip she could weaponize to fix the fact that her beloved son-in-law was a fraudulent, degenerate gambler who had just bankrupted her husband. Marcus Thorne, the aggressively tanned lawyer who had been shouting at me just 10 minutes prior, was moving with frantic, panicked efficiency. He was violently shoving his gold pens, legal pads, and files back into his leather briefcase. He did not look at Trent. He did not look at Calvin. He looked directly at Jordan. "As an officer of the court, I cannot and will not be a party to suborning perjury," Thorne declared, his voice shaking with professional terror. "I was not informed of these forensic realities. I am officially withdrawing my representation of Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Preston effective immediately. I advise you both to retain criminal defense counsel." Without waiting for a response, Thorne snapped his briefcase shut, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted out of the boardroom. The heavy glass door slammed shut behind him, sealing my family inside the tomb they had dug for themselves. I looked at the court reporter, who was staring wide-eyed at the remaining occupants. "You can stop typing," I told her gently. "The deposition is over. We will take the rest of this conversation off the record." The reporter nodded quickly, packed up her stenography machine, and hurried out of the room, clearly eager to escape the radioactive blast zone of my family's collapse. Jordan remained seated beside me, perfectly still, a silent apex predator, watching the prey bleed out. With Thorne and the reporter gone, the last remaining shreds of Trent's facade burned away. Backed into a corner, stripped of his legal shield and exposed as a complete fraud, the charming tech genius vanished entirely. He stopped pretending to be panicked. He stopped acting like a victim. He slowly stood up from his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, and let out a harsh, ugly laugh. He looked around the room, completely unbothered by his wife's sobbing or his father-in-law's hyperventilation. He looked at me, and his handsome face twisted into a vicious sneer. "You think you are so brilliant," Maya Trent said, leaning his palms on the table. "You think you can just walk in here with your expensive corporate lawyer and your fancy forensic accounting and completely destroy my life. You think you have won." I did not move. I just watched him, allowing his narcissism to fuel his own destruction. "You destroyed your own life, Trent," I replied, my tone completely clinical. "I just brought the receipts." Trent let out another sharp laugh, shaking his head. He paced behind Calvin's chair, looking down at the gasping older man with absolute, undisguised disgust. "Do you have any idea how incredibly easy it was to con this man, Trent?" asked, pointing a finger at the back of Calvin's head. "He practically begged me to take his money. All I had to do was throw around a few buzzwords about algorithms and blockchain and compliment his status at the church. He was so blinded by his own greed and his desperate need to look like a savvy investor that he signed those home equity line of credit documents without even reading the second page. He wanted to be a tech millionaire so badly that he handed over his house to a guy he barely knew. Calvin let out a choked, strangled sound, pressing his hands over his face, but Trent ignored him entirely. Trent locked his eyes back onto mine, his confidence returning in a dark, twisted wave. "But I am not a stupid man," Maya Trent continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. "I knew exactly what I was doing when I wired that money offshore. I knew there was a risk that the syndicates would bleed me dry, and I knew that eventually someone with a ledger was going to come knocking. I knew I needed an insurance policy." Trent reached into his inner suit pocket. For a fleeting second, Chloe flinched, but Trent only pulled out his sleek silver smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, bringing up an audio file. He held the phone up so we could all see the screen. "You see, when Calvin and I sat down in his home office to finalize the transfer of those funds, I made sure my phone was recording." Trent sneered, a malicious, triumphant light dancing in his eyes. "I told Calvin that transferring $200,000 stateside would trigger massive IRS audits. I told him the government would take half his equity in taxes. I suggested we route the money through a holding company in the Caymans to keep it completely hidden from the federal government." Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes widening in sheer terror. Calvin stopped gasping, his entire body going rigid. "And your beloved Holy Father," Trent laughed, pressing his finger against the play button on the screen, agreed completely. A tinny, slightly muffled audio recording filled the quiet boardroom. Trent's voice echoed from the speaker, asking a direct question. "So we route the $200K through the offshore holding LLC. It keeps the IRS completely out of our pockets and avoids any capital gains taxes on the initial transfer. You are good with dodging the tax man on this, Calvin." Then Calvin's unmistakable booming voice replied from the phone. "The Lord helps those who help themselves, Trent. If we can keep the federal government out of our family investments, we do it. Wire it offshore." Trent paused the recording and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He leaned across the polished mahogany table, staring directly into my eyes, his face mere inches from the forensic dossier that outlined his crimes. He smiled a wide, terrifying grin, believing he had just checkmated me on the board I built. "You think this financial forensic report proves anything?" Maya Trent sneered, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "You think you can use it to put me in jail for wire fraud? Go ahead, take it to the authorities. But the second you do, I hand that audio recording directly over to the FBI and the IRS." Trent straightened his posture, looking down at me with absolute supreme arrogance. "If I go down for wire fraud and illegal gambling, your beloved father goes to federal prison with me for conspiracy to commit tax evasion and international money laundering," Trent stated clearly. "So here's what is going to happen, Maya. You are going to void the acceleration clause. You are going to sign the deed over to me free and clear. And you are going to walk out of this building and never mention Vanguard Holdings again. Because if you do not, you will be the reason your father spends the last years of his life in a federal penitentiary." The Atlanta Heritage Real Estate Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the city's corporate social calendar. Held in the vaulted, gilded ballroom of the historic Biltmore Hotel, it was a room overflowing with bespoke tuxedos, dripping diamonds, and the kind of generational wealth that insulated people from the consequences of reality. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of Atlanta elite, while towering ice sculptures slowly melted onto tables laden with caviar and imported champagne. Tonight, however, the glittering lights felt like harsh interrogation lamps for Calvin and Evelyn. I watched them from across the room, nursing a glass of sparkling water. They looked absolutely terrified. Evelyn was wearing a stunning sapphire gown, but her posture was completely rigid, her knuckles bone white as she gripped a heavily beaded clutch. She was trying desperately to network, attempting to engage in the usual high society gossip, but her anxiety was palpable. People were politely excusing themselves from her presence, sensing the radioactive panic radiating from her pores. Calvin, usually the booming center of any social circle, looked like a man walking to his own execution. He was sweating profusely, repeatedly, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief, and nodding mechanically at the local politicians and developers who stopped to shake his hand. The blackmail was eating them alive from the inside out. Trent's audio recording had trapped Calvin in a federal tax evasion conspiracy, and the sheer terror of facing an IRS audit and a potential federal prison sentence had completely broken my father's spirit. He had built his entire identity on being the righteous, untouchable patriarch of Greater Grace Fellowship. Now he knew he was just a desperate pawn in his son-in-law's criminal gambling ring. They were smiling for the cameras, posing for the society photographers. But I could see the absolute suffocating panic behind their eyes. They were hostages in their own social kingdom, entirely at the mercy of the monster they had invited into their home. Trent, on the other hand, was thriving. He strutted through the ballroom with a glass of expensive reserve bourbon in his hand, working the crowd like a conquering king returning from battle. He genuinely believed his little extortion play in the boardroom last week had neutralized me permanently. He thought threatening my father with federal prison had forced my unconditional surrender. He was wearing a custom velvet dinner jacket, laughing loudly and throwing his head back at jokes made by city councilmen. Chloe clung tightly to his arm, playing the adoring, supportive wife, her previous horror regarding the stolen money completely suppressed by her desperate need to maintain her country club status. She was willing to ignore the illegal sports betting and the offshore accounts as long as she could keep wearing her designer shoes and attending galas. They were a perfectly curated illusion of young, wealthy success, masking a foundation of absolute rot. Trent caught my eye from across the room and raised his bourbon glass in a mocking toast, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his handsome face. He thought I was here to wave a white flag. He thought I was here to watch him take his victory lap and silently accept my defeat. I turned away from his gloating and made my way toward the massive, cascading champagne tower at the edge of the ballroom. I needed a moment of quiet before the evening's main event officially kicked off. But peace was not on the agenda for tonight. Before I could even reach for a crystal flute, I found myself completely boxed in. Trent materialized on my left, his expensive cologne heavy and cloying in the warm air. On my right stood his parents Richard and Victoria Blackwood. The Blackwoods were the absolute epitome of arrogant inherited wealth. Richard was a retired hedge fund manager who looked at everyone as if they owed him money, and Victoria was a terrifyingly polished socialite whose entire personality revolved around hosting charitable galas and delivering passive-aggressive insults. They had always treated my family like a quaint charity project, a slightly embarrassing church family that their brilliant son was generously elevating by marrying into. Trent draped his arm casually over his mother's shoulder, grinning at me with teeth that looked entirely too sharp. "Look who it is," Trent sneered, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "I am honestly surprised you showed up tonight, Maya. I figured you would be at home licking your wounds and packing up your little corporate ambitions. It takes a lot of nerve to show your face in a room full of real players after the beating you took last week." Victoria adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, looking me up and down with absolute unfiltered disdain. She took a slow sip of her champagne before leaning in, her voice a low conspiratorial whisper meant to cut deep. "Trent told us about the minor family squabble in the boardroom," Victoria said, her tone sickly sweet and completely lethal. "We understand you were throwing quite the hysterical tantrum over some real estate paperwork. It is honestly sad to see you acting this way, Maya." I did not flinch. I kept my gaze locked directly on hers, my expression a mask of carved stone. "It was not a squabble, Victoria," I replied, my voice perfectly, even cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom. "It was a forensic audit revealing your son's massive illegal sports gambling debts and his offshore money laundering accounts." Victoria's smile tightened significantly, but she did not break her arrogant character. She waved a manicured hand in the air as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Oh, please do not be so incredibly dramatic, Maya. Businessmen move money around all the time to protect their assets from overreaching taxation. You are just upset because you do not have the sophisticated financial understanding that Trent does. It is a terrible shame you could not be a team player for your family. Trent is taking such good care of your parents, making sure their little church estate is properly managed and shielded. You should really take notes instead of trying to tear down your own brother-in-law out of bitter spinster jealousy. We all know it kills you to see Chloe so happy and provided for while you are entirely alone. Richard chimed in, his voice a low, arrogant rumble pressing his advantage. You should listen to your mother, Maya. Trent is the future of this family, and the future of this city's real estate market. You should be thanking him on your knees for securing your father's legacy instead of launching hysterical, baseless legal attacks. If you have even a shred of intelligence left, you will drop this ridiculous crusade, cancel your little lawsuits, and let the men handle the serious business. Do not make us destroy what little reputation you have left in this town. I looked at Trent, who was practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction. He really thought his parents' wealth and his blackmail tape made him bulletproof. He thought he had completely outsmarted me using my own father's pastoral greed as an impenetrable shield. He thought he held all the cards, and that I was nothing more than an annoying obstacle he had successfully swatted out of his path. I slowly lowered my gaze to my left wrist, pushing back the silk sleeve of my tailored emerald gown. I checked the face of my diamond watch. The second hand ticked precisely past the 12. It was exactly 8 o'clock, the exact moment I had been waiting for all evening. I looked back up at Victoria, meeting her condescending stare with absolute sub-zero calm. I prefer to let my actions speak for themselves, Victoria, I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously quiet. Before Victoria could formulate another venomous insult, the heavy bass of the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system thumped, capturing the attention of the entire room. The glittering chandeliers dimmed slightly, and a bright spotlight hit the main stage. The master of ceremonies, a prominent and highly respected local news anchor, stepped up to the microphone, tapping it twice to signal the beginning of the program. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, his voice echoing across the suddenly hushed crowd. Welcome to the Atlanta Heritage Real Estate Gala. Tonight we are celebrating the visionaries, the builders, and the financial titans who are literally rebuilding this great city from the ground up. But before we begin our awards ceremony, we have a very special announcement regarding the future of downtown Atlanta. Trent smirked, taking another arrogant sip of his bourbon, completely oblivious to the trap snapping shut around him. We want to extend our deepest gratitude to tonight's surprise keynote sponsor. The MC continued, gesturing dramatically toward the center of the stage. The driving force behind the largest downtown commercial revitalization project in the state of Georgia. Please direct your attention to the screens and give a warm welcome to the founder and sole owner of Vanguard Holdings, Maya Preston. The sheer volume of the applause was deafening, but the absolute dead silence from the people standing immediately around me was what truly resonated. I did not move right away. I simply stood there holding my glass of sparkling water and watched the tectonic plates of the Blackwood and Preston families violently shift and collapse. Victoria Blackwood looked as though the air had been forcefully vacuumed from her lungs. Her meticulously powdered face turned a sickening shade of gray, and her jaw went completely slack. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist trembled violently as her hand shook. Richard stood frozen, his arrogant posture dissolving into the rigid stance of a man who had just stepped on a live landmine. They had just spent the last 5 minutes treating the owner of a multi-million-dollar financial empire like an impoverished charity case. Trent was completely paralyzed. The crystal tumbler of reserve bourbon slipped from his grip. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp crack, sending amber liquid and shards of expensive glass splashing across his custom velvet shoes. He did not even look down. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed entirely on my face. The smug, impenetrable armor he had worn since the day he married into my family shattered instantly. I handed my glass to a passing waiter, smoothed the front of my emerald gown, and walked toward the main stage. I did not look back at them. I did not need to. The long walk through the center of the gilded ballroom was a masterclass in shifting power dynamics. Every titan of industry, every city councilman, and every major developer in Atlanta turned to watch me. I glided up the carpeted stairs and stepped into the blinding glare of the spotlight, taking my place behind the acrylic podium. I looked out over the sea of faces, adjusting the microphone. In the second row, seated at table 4, I spotted the senior leadership of Greater Grace Fellowship. The church elders, the deacons, and the board of trustees were all leaning forward, eager to hear from the surprise benefactor of the night. At table 1, seated directly in my line of sight, were my parents. Evelyn was gripping the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow. Calvin looked physically ill, his face slick with sweat. And standing near the back of the room, bathed in the shadows of the champagne tower, was Trent. "Good evening, everyone." I began, my voice projecting with crisp, absolute authority across the ballroom. "It is a profound honor to stand before the architects, the visionaries, and the true leaders of Atlanta. Vanguard Holdings has always operated quietly, focusing on strategic acquisitions and distressed corporate debt. We have built our success not by seeking the spotlight, but by prioritizing integrity, transparency, and relentless accountability." A polite murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. I let my gaze sweep over the room, making deliberate eye contact with the church elders before letting my eyes lock directly onto Trent. "But tonight, we are stepping out of the shadows because true leadership requires action." I continued, the cadence of my speech perfectly measured. Real estate is not just about concrete and capital, it is about families. It is about providing a foundation for the future and protecting the legacies of those who came before us. Unfortunately, the very assets meant to provide security for our elderly citizens are increasingly being weaponized against them. The ballroom fell into a completely captivated hush. The clinking of silverware stopped. 1,000 pairs of eyes were fixed entirely on me. "That is why tonight I am proud to officially announce the launch of a new philanthropic initiative," I said, gripping the edges of the podium. "Vanguard Holdings is committing $5 million to establish the Vanguard Fund. This organization is designed specifically to provide elite forensic accounting and legal defense resources to elderly citizens who are victims of predatory financial abuse by their own family members." At table 1, my mother closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "Elder abuse is a silent epidemic," I continued, my voice dropping into a register of surgical precision. "And the most dangerous predators do not break through the windows in the middle of the night. They walk through the front door invited. They sit at the dinner table. They marry into the family. They use charm buzzwords and manufactured affection to blind their victims." To illustrate why this fund is so desperately needed, I want to share a recent case study our firm uncovered right here in Atlanta. I watched Trent take a single step forward, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was trapped. He could not leave without drawing the attention of the entire room, and he could not stay without listening to his own public execution. "Just a few weeks ago, we audited a distressed debt portfolio," I stated, laying out the facts with merciless clarity. "We uncovered a case where an elderly couple, respected pillars of their local church community, were systematically targeted by their new son-in-law. This young man presented himself as a visionary tech genius. He convinced his medically vulnerable father-in-law to take out a $200,000 home equity line of credit against the family estate. He claimed the money was seed capital for a revolutionary cryptocurrency startup. He produced fake pitch decks, fake business plans, and leveraged the couple's absolute trust to secure the loan." Whispers began to break out across the ballroom. The elite of Atlanta were highly intelligent people. They were connecting the dots, analyzing the sudden tension in the room, and following my gaze toward the back of the hall. The church elders at table 4 were staring at me in absolute stunned horror, slowly turning their heads to look at Calvin. "But our forensic audit revealed the devastating reality," I said, projecting over the growing whispers. "There was no crypto startup. There were no developers. Within 48 hours of that elderly man depositing his hard-earned home equity into the son-in-law's account, the money was wired directly to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. It was then funneled into international syndicates to pay off massive, spiraling, illegal sports gambling debts." I paused, letting the sheer weight of the felony wash over the crowd. I watched Richard and Victoria Blackwood practically shrinking into the shadows, their faces burning with unimaginable public humiliation. Their perfect son, their golden legacy was being vivisected in front of their entire social circle. But the true cruelty of this predator did not end with theft. I continued delivering the final fatal strike to Trent's blackmail scheme. Knowing he was committing federal wire fraud, this son-in-law manufactured a trap. He explicitly advised his father-in-law that routing the money offshore was a standard strategy to avoid capital gains taxes. He manipulated an elderly man with zero corporate financial literacy into verbally agreeing to this offshore transfer. The predator then recorded that conversation, planning to use it to blackmail the victim with false accusations of tax evasion if his gambling crimes were ever discovered. He weaponized a father's trust to build a cage. The silence that fell over the Biltmore ballroom was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and complete. The church elders were visibly aghast, shaking their heads in disgust. Chloe had completely collapsed into a chair by the wall, burying her face in her hands. Calvin and Evelyn sat paralyzed, realizing that their daughter had just publicly, completely cleared them of any criminal intent, while simultaneously destroying the man who had terrorized them. The audio recording Trent thought was his ultimate weapon was now legally categorized as evidence of elder coercion and predatory manipulation. It was entirely useless. The Vanguard Fund exists to ensure that predators like this are permanently neutralized, I concluded, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. We will pursue these individuals relentlessly. We will trace every stolen cent. We will protect our vulnerable citizens, and we will ensure that those who seek to destroy families from the inside are exposed to the blinding light of justice. Thank you. I stepped back from the podium. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Then, the ballroom erupted. The applause was not just polite, it was thunderous. The church elders were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically. But I was not looking at them. I was looking at Trent. His face was completely devoid of blood, matching the stark white collar of his tuxedo shirt. His jaw trembled, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. He looked around the room, seeing the disgusted glares of his parents' peers, realizing that his reputation, his marriage, his freedom, and his entire future in this city had just been completely annihilated. The brilliant tech genius was gone, leaving nothing but a desperate, cornered animal. Trent snapped, completely abandoning any remaining shred of sanity or self-preservation. He shoved past his horrified mother, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses. He stormed directly onto the main floor, his eyes wild and completely unhinged, pointing a shaking finger directly at me as he marched toward the stage. The heavy crunch of shattered crystal beneath Trent's velvet shoes echoed through the cavernous ballroom as he marched toward the stage. The elite of Atlanta parted like the Red Sea, scrambling to get out of the path of a man who had completely lost his mind. Security guards stationed at the perimeter immediately moved to intercept him, rushing toward the steps of the stage with their hands reaching for their radios. I did not step back. I raised my hand in a sharp, decisive gesture, signaling the guards to stand down. I wanted him to do this. I wanted every single politician, investor, and socialite in this room to witness the absolute destruction of Trent Blackwood's carefully constructed facade. Trent bounded up the carpeted stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He crossed the stage and slammed his hands down on either side of my acrylic podium, caging me in. His face was flushed an angry mottled red, and his breath reeked of expensive bourbon and desperate panic. "You shut your mouth right now," Trent hissed, his voice a ragged, venomous whisper meant only for me. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my parents, in front of this entire city? I will ruin you, Maya. I will release that audio file to the IRS tonight. I will make sure your father dies in a federal prison cell, and I will make sure everyone knows you are the one who put him there." I looked at him, my expression completely devoid of fear. I reached up and adjusted the microphone, pulling it a fraction of an inch closer to my mouth, ensuring that my response would boom through the state-of-the-art sound system and wash over the dead, silent ballroom. "My brother-in-law believes he holds a trump card," I announced, my voice echoing off the gilded ceiling. "He is currently threatening me with an audio recording. A recording he claims proves my father actively conspired to commit international tax evasion. He believes this digital file is his ultimate leverage, his get-out-of-jail-free card to avoid the consequences of embezzling $250,000. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. At table 1, Calvin slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands, bracing himself for the final blow that would end his life as he knew it. There is just one fundamental flaw in his brilliant extortion strategy. I continued, locking my eyes onto Trent's panicked face. When Vanguard Holdings legally acquired your fraudulent tech startup's corporate debt, we also legally acquired complete access to your company's cloud storage servers. The same servers where your phone automatically backs up your digital files, including your little insurance policy. Trent's hands slipped from the podium. He took a single shaky step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits. I did not just listen to your recording, Trent, I said, my voice turning as cold as liquid nitrogen. I handed it over to one of the premier forensic audio specialists in the country, and what they found in the digital metadata was truly fascinating. They analyzed the waveform and discovered exactly 11 different splice points. You did not record a single conversation with my father. You took fragments of conversations over a span of 3 weeks, isolated them, and stitched them together using basic audio editing software to manufacture a confession. Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. But the most compelling part of the forensic analysis I projected, making sure every syllable struck him like a physical blow, was the recovery of the original unedited source files. The raw audio clearly captures you screaming at an elderly man. It captures you explicitly lying to him about federal banking regulations and coercing him into signing transfer documents under extreme emotional duress. I looked past Trent, directing my gaze down to table 1. Calvin slowly raised his head. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and overwhelming relief. He realized in that exact moment that the daughter he had publicly vilified, the daughter he had committed perjury to destroy, was standing on a stage in front of the entire city, saving his life. The raw audio proves beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that Calvin Preston had absolutely zero criminal intent, I declared, ensuring the church elders at table 4 heard every word. He was not a co-conspirator in tax evasion. He was the victim of a calculated predatory extortion scheme. I turned my attention back to Trent, who was now physically trembling, his custom suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. You asked me in the boardroom last week if I thought a forensic audit proved anything, I said, leaning slightly over the podium. I told you, I prefer to let my actions speak for themselves. I did not just bring those unedited source files to this gala, Trent. 2 days ago, I handed the complete forensic audit, the offshore wire trails, and the unedited audio recordings directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs. Richard and Victoria Blackwood, who were still standing near the champagne tower, physically recoiled as if Trent had just caught fire. Richard turned his back completely, refusing to even look at the stage, while Victoria covered her face with her beaded clutch, entirely humiliated by her son's public crucifixion. My father has been fully officially cleared of any wrongdoing by federal authorities, I announced, delivering the final lethal strike. You, however, are currently facing a grand jury indictment for wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, and interstate extortion. Checkmate, Trent. The reality of his absolute annihilation finally pierced through his narcissistic delusion. The flight response kicked in with violent urgency. Trent spun around, practically tripping over his own feet, and bolted for the edge of the stage. He scrambled down the stairs, stumbling onto the marble floor, and sprinted toward the heavy oak double doors at the back of the ballroom. He shoved past a group of startled waiters, sending a tray of appetizers clattering to the ground. He hit the brass handles of the doors with his full body weight, bursting into the brightly lit grand lobby of the Biltmore Hotel. But his desperate escape ended exactly 3 feet beyond the threshold. Waiting in the center of the lobby, illuminated by the crystal chandeliers, were four individuals wearing dark windbreakers with large yellow letters printed across the back, FBI. Trent slammed on the brakes, his shoes skidding on the polished stone. Two federal agents stepped forward with practiced, terrifying efficiency. One agent grabbed Trent's shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the intricately carved wooden doorframe. The harsh, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed into the silent ballroom. "Trent Blackwood, you are under arrest for wire fraud and extortion," the lead agent stated, his voice carrying clearly through the open doors. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Inside the ballroom, the illusion shattered completely. Chloe let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She hiked up the skirt of her heavy designer gown and sprinted across the commercial carpet, her high heels clicking frantically. She reached the back of the room just as the agents began dragging a sobbing, completely broken Trent toward the hotel exit. "Trent!" Chloe shrieked, reaching out for him as the lobby doors began to swing shut. She spun around, her face contorted in absolute panic, and locked eyes with our parents at table 1. "Do something!" Chloe screamed at them, her voice echoing with the entitlement of a golden child who had never faced a single consequence in her entire life. "Dad, call a lawyer. Get up and do something. He is your son-in-law." For the first time in 30 years, the dynamic fundamentally broke. Calvin Preston did not rush to save her. He did not pull out his checkbook to cover up her mess. Calvin slowly stood up from the table, tears streaming down his face. He looked at the daughter who had conspired to steal his home, the daughter who had watched her husband actively threaten him with federal prison. Calvin physically took a step back, shaking his head. He looked at Chloe with an expression of profound, devastating horror, realizing exactly what kind of monster he had enabled. Evelyn sat rigidly beside him, her face buried in her hands, completely turning her back on her youngest child. They were abandoning the sinking ship, leaving Chloe to drown in the wreckage of her own arrogance. I stood silently at the acrylic podium, looking out over the ballroom. The threat was neutralized. The predator was in handcuffs. The family hierarchy had been permanently dismantled, and I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. The heavy brass handles of the Biltmore Hotel doors swung shut with a resounding finality, cutting off Trent's frantic screaming. For a microscopic second, the ballroom remained suspended in absolute shock. The silence was so profound that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning units and the faint clinking of ice melting in the champagne tower. Then the room exploded. The deafening roar of 500 deeply scandalized Atlanta elites erupted simultaneously. It was a chaotic symphony of frantic whispering, aggressive finger-pointing, and the desperate tapping of smartphones as the city's most powerful players scrambled to contact their public relations teams and financial advisors. The pristine illusion of the untouchable Preston and Blackwood alliance had not just cracked, it had been subjected to a controlled demolition. I stood perfectly still behind the acrylic podium, watching the social hierarchy ruthlessly correct itself. The elders of Greater Grace Fellowship, the men who had spent decades nodding along to my father's booming sermons and quietly judging my single status, turned their backs on Calvin in perfect synchronized unison. They clustered together near table 4, shaking their heads in theatrical disgust. I could practically see them drafting the emergency board meeting agenda that would officially strip my father of his pastoral titles, sever his church pension, and distance their congregation from the radioactive fallout of a federal wire fraud investigation. Calvin was instantly transformed from their spiritual leader into a massive, catastrophic liability. Richard and Victoria Blackwood proved exactly why they had survived in the ruthless shark tank of generational wealth. Survival meant severing dead weight instantly. Victoria did not rush to comfort her sobbing, hysterical daughter-in-law. Instead, she grabbed Richard's arm, her face a mask of furious self-preservation. They marched directly past Chloe, ignoring her outstretched hand and her desperate pleading. Victoria looked right through her as if Chloe had suddenly become entirely transparent. They swept past Evelyn and Calvin without a single backward glance, abandoning the sinking ship of their interconnected families. They were already strategizing how to spin Trent's arrest, as a tragic, isolated mental health crisis, entirely separate from their pristine family trust and their vast real estate empire. Chloe meant absolutely nothing to them without the illusion of perfection. Chloe was left completely alone standing on the commercial carpet. She looked around wildly, her tear-streaked face searching for a single sympathetic eye in the crowd. She found absolutely none. The society wives who had kissed her cheek and complimented her designer gown just 20 minutes ago were now actively pulling their husbands away from her, treating her like she was carrying a highly contagious disease. The exodus from the ballroom was swift and brutal. Nobody wanted to be photographed near the blast zone of a federal money laundering scandal. Within 15 minutes, the sprawling gilded room was practically a ghost town. The catering staff quietly emerged from the kitchens, hastily clearing the untouched caviar and melting ice sculptures, avoiding any eye contact with the remaining stragglers. The grand Biltmore ballroom had transformed from a glittering coronation of Atlanta royalty into a massive echoing tomb. I slowly gathered my prepared notes from the podium, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of clarity wash over me. Jordan stepped up beside me, his face an unreadable mask of professional satisfaction. He offered a slight approving nod, a silent acknowledgement of a flawlessly executed strategy, before stepping back to give me space for what was coming next. I walked down the carpeted stairs of the stage, my heels echoing sharply in the cavernous room. Waiting for me at the base of the champagne tower were the shattered remnants of my family. They looked entirely unrecognizable. The haughty arrogance, the religious superiority, the suffocating entitlement had all been violently stripped away, leaving behind three desperate, terrified strangers. Calvin looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. His broad, powerful shoulders were hunched, his breathing shallow and erratic. He could not even bring himself to look me in the eye, staring firmly at the polished marble floor. The realization that he had handed his kingdom to a predator and nearly gone to federal prison for it had completely broken his spirit. Chloe was hyperventilating, clutching her expensive beaded bag like a life preserver, her carefully applied makeup ruined by rivers of black mascara. She was staring at the doorway where Trent had just been dragged out, her fairy tale violently terminated. But it was Evelyn who finally broke the heavy, suffocating silence. Evelyn took a hesitant step toward me, her hands trembling violently. "Maya," she began, her voice entirely devoid of its usual sharp, commanding edge. It was a fragile, pathetic sound that I had never heard her make in my entire 35 years of life. "Maya, you have to understand. We had absolutely no idea. We were completely deceived. Trent lied to us. He manipulated your father. He used our faith against us. You cannot blame us for trusting family." I stopped 3 feet away from her, crossing my arms and tilting my head. The word family sounded incredibly toxic coming from her lips, especially after she had just spent the last week actively participating in a blackmail scheme to destroy my life. "We are your parents, Maya," Evelyn continued, tears finally spilling over her carefully powdered cheeks. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered desperation. "We made mistakes, yes. We were perhaps too hard on you. But we were just trying to protect your future. We wanted you to be successful. We did not know he was a monster. You proved it. You saved your father from prison. We are so grateful, Maya. We are so incredibly grateful." She reached out, attempting to grab my hand to force a moment of maternal connection, but I smoothly took a step back, letting her fingers grasp empty air. Evelyn choked back a sob, dropping her hand to her side. "Maya, they are taking the house." Evelyn blurted out the shameful truth, finally bursting to the surface, stripping away her last shred of dignity. "The bank was notified about the fraud investigation yesterday morning. They triggered a default protocol on the mortgage. The property is officially going into auction by the end of the month. The church board just texted Calvin. They are demanding his immediate resignation and freezing his pension until the legal mess is sorted out. Trent drained everything we had, Maya. Every single savings account, every retirement fund. We have absolutely nothing left." Chloe let out a loud, tragic wail, finally pulling her eyes away from the door and looking at me. "Trent is going to federal prison," Chloe sobbed. her voice cracking. "And I have nowhere to go. The Blackwoods have completely cut me off. Richard's assistant just texted me that they canceled my credit cards while I was standing here in the lobby. They are locking me out of the penthouse." Evelyn took a shuddering breath, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "We know you own dozens of properties," Evelyn begged, the words tumbling out in a rush of ultimate humiliation. "We know Vanguard Holdings has an entire portfolio of residential real estate in the metro area. Please, Maya, we are family. We have nowhere else to go. Just let us move into one of your rental properties. We will pay you back. We will do whatever you want. Please do not let your parents end up on the street." I stood in the quiet ballroom, surrounded by the fading echo of high society and the utter wreckage of my abusers. I looked at Evelyn, whose entire identity was built on looking down on me and maintaining a flawless public image. I looked at Calvin, the righteous patriarch, who had gladly thrown me to the wolves to protect his own greed and pride. I looked at Chloe, the golden child, who had mocked my ambition while funding her luxury lifestyle with stolen equity and criminal gambling money. For 35 years, they had made me feel small. They had criticized my career choices, diminished my hard-earned accomplishments, and demanded my complete subservience to their twisted, toxic family narrative. They had tried to steal my company, bankrupt my future, and destroy my professional reputation, all while expecting me to smile and take the abuse in the name of family loyalty. Now they were standing in front of me, completely stripped of their unearned power, begging for shelter from the very daughter they had spent a lifetime trying to break. The absolute silence of the room stretched out heavy with anticipation. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of clarity wash over me. I uncrossed my arms and looked directly into my mother's desperate, terrified eyes, preparing to deliver my final verdict. I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years meticulously measuring my worth and deficits. Evelyn was trembling so violently that the expensive diamonds around her neck clattered together. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her hands were clasped together in a posture of desperate, frantic prayer. She was waiting for me to break. She was counting on the decades of conditioning, the ingrained expectation that I would step up, sacrifice myself, and fix their catastrophic mistakes. She truly believed that underneath my tailored emerald gown and my corporate titles, I was still the desperate, unloved middle child who would accept any scrap of affection if it meant finally being accepted into the family fold. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute absurdity of her request to settle over the empty ballroom. The catering staff had vanished. The musicians had packed up their instruments. The glittering elite of Atlanta were already in their town cars drafting text messages about the spectacular downfall of Calvin Preston. "You want one of my properties," I stated, my voice perfectly calm, echoing in the cavernous space. "After you actively conspired to let Trent destroy me. After you sat at dinner tables and allowed him to insult me. After you called my career a joke, my life a disappointment, and my presence an inconvenience. You want me to hand you the keys to a house I built with the money you mocked." Evelyn flinched as if I had physically struck her. "Maya, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "We are your blood. We are your parents. You cannot just leave us with nothing. We will be ruined." "Blood is merely a biological fact, Evelyn," I replied, maintaining my icy composure. "Family is a choice. It is a choice you made every single day of my life, and it is a choice you never once made when it came to me. You chose the illusion of perfection. You chose the country club. You chose a predator in a velvet jacket because he promised to elevate your social status." Calvin finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in surrender. "Maya, listen to reason. We were blind. I was a fool. I see that now. But you proved tonight that you have power. You have the resources. You are the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. You can fix this. You can make a call to the bank. You can talk to the church board. Just give us a chance to make it right." I looked at my father. The booming, charismatic patriarch who had commanded thousands from a pulpit was gone. He was just a terrified old man clutching at the wreckage of his own arrogance. "I am not your savior, Calvin," I said, my words cutting through the air like shattered glass. "And I am certainly no longer your scapegoat. You built a house of cards on a foundation of greed, and now you are angry that the wind finally blew. I took a step closer, ensuring they could see the absolute lack of pity in my eyes. Just a few days ago, you told me I was a bitter spinster trying to ruin your legacy. I continued delivering the final, unvarnished truth. You told me I was not a team player. You did not have enough space for me at your anniversary table when you thought you were kings. I do not have enough space in my life for your consequences. Chloe let out a fresh wail of despair, dropping to her knees on the commercial carpet. Maya, please, she begged, clutching the fabric of her ruined designer gown. My credit cards are declining. Trent's parents will not even answer my calls. The police took my car keys because the lease was under his fraudulent holding company. I have absolutely nothing. I do not know how to survive like this. You wanted the crown, Chloe, I said, looking down at my sobbing sister. Heavy lies the head. You tolerated his abuse, you ignored his gambling, and you laughed at me because you thought his stolen money made you untouchable. Now you get to experience the real world. Welcome to it. Evelyn reached out one last time, her fingers desperately grasping at the air inches from my arm. You cannot just turn your back on us. You cannot just walk away and leave us to drown. I am not leaving you to drown, Evelyn, I said softly, adjusting my silk sleeve. I am simply letting you stay exactly where you put yourselves. I turned my back on them. The physical action felt like breaking a heavy iron chain that had been wrapped around my chest since childhood. I did not feel guilt. I did not feel regret. I felt an overwhelming, blinding sense of liberation. Jordan was waiting for me at the edge of the stage, his posture relaxed, but his eyes shining with profound respect. He offered me his arm, and I took it. Together we walked down the center aisle of the Biltmore Ballroom. Behind me, the sounds of Evelyn weeping, Calvin's hollow apologies, and Chloe's hysterical sobbing echoed against the gilded walls. I did not look back, not even once. We walked through the heavy oak double doors out into the crisp, cool Atlanta night air, leaving them behind in the empty ruins of their own making. 6 months passed. The city of Atlanta moved on as it always does when false idols inevitably fall. The scandal dominated the social circles and local news for weeks before fading into the archives of society gossip. But the consequences of that night were permanent and absolute. Trent Blackwood's arrogance completely crumbled under the relentless pressure of a federal interrogation. Faced with the unedited audio files, the offshore wire trails, and the mountain of forensic evidence my firm provided, his high-priced defense attorneys advised him to surrender. He accepted a plea deal to avoid a protracted public trial, but the judge showed no mercy to a man who preyed on the elderly. Trent was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. The Blackwood family, in a masterstroke of ruthless self-preservation, legally severed all ties with him. Richard and Victoria released a sterile public statement expressing their deep disappointment in their son's isolated actions and completely erased him from their family trust. Trent went from a penthouse suite to a concrete cell stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom. The Preston family faced a different kind of prison. The bank seized the sprawling Beacon Hill-style mansion exactly as scheduled. It was auctioned off to a commercial real estate developer for pennies on the dollar. Disgraced and completely bankrupt, Calvin and Evelyn were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a declining suburb they used to actively lobby against. Without his church pension or his pastoral titles, Calvin was forced to take a job managing inventory at a local hardware store. The man who used to deliver sermons to thousands now spent his days wearing a blue vest and organizing boxes of nails, taking orders from managers half his age. Evelyn became a complete recluse. Her entire identity had been tied to her social status, her designer clothes, and her ability to look down on others. Stripped of those things, she was too deeply ashamed to even show her face at the local grocery store, terrified of running into the women she used to host at her lavish garden parties. They lived in bitter, quiet isolation, surrounded by the consequences of their own vanity. Chloe experienced the harshest reality check of all. The Blackwood family lawyers executed Trent's ironclad prenuptial agreement with lethal efficiency. Because Trent was convicted of federal financial crimes, all marital assets were seized or frozen, leaving Chloe with absolutely nothing. Her designer bags and jewelry were sold to pay for her immediate legal fees. The pampered golden child who had never worked a day in her life was forced to get a job. She now works at the reception desk of a mid-tier day spa in Buckhead. Every day she is forced to wear a polyester uniform, smile politely, and fetch warm towels for the exact same wealthy socialites she used to gossip with. They do not look at her. They do not invite her to their galas. She is completely invisible to the world she once ruled. As for me, I stood on the wraparound balcony of the Vanguard Holdings corporate penthouse, looking out over the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta. The night air was warm, and the city looked alive with possibility. The Vanguard Fund had been a massive, unprecedented success. In just 6 months, we had provided forensic accounting and legal resources to dozens of elderly victims, recovering millions of dollars from predatory family members. The initiative had earned national recognition, but more importantly, it had given me a profound sense of purpose. I had taken the deepest trauma of my life and weaponized it into a shield for others. Jordan stepped out onto the balcony, handing me a glass of sparkling water. He leaned against the glass railing, looking out at the city before turning his gaze to me. "We just closed the acquisition on the new commercial complex in Midtown." "Jordan," said, a genuine warm smile spreading across his face. "The board is thrilled. You built an empire, Maya." I took a sip of the sparkling water, feeling the cool effervescence against my throat. I thought about the scared little girl who used to hide in her bedroom while her parents praised her sister. I thought about the woman who had worked 80-hour weeks, just hoping for a single nod of parental approval. That woman was gone. She had been burned away in the fire of their betrayal and replaced by someone who knew exactly what she was worth. "We built an empire," I corrected him, returning his smile. "And we did it on our own terms." I turned back to look at the city lights. I had not just survived my family, I had outgrown them. I had finally learned that true power does not come from the approval of others or the validation of a toxic hierarchy. True power comes from having the vision to see your own potential, the courage to defend your own boundaries, and the absolute unshakable wisdom to know when to walk away. Trent Blackwood was rapidly learning that the federal justice system did not care about his velvet dinner jackets or his charming boardroom smile. 6 months after his spectacular arrest in the grand lobby of the Biltmore Hotel, his reality had been reduced to a bleak concrete cell at the United States Penitentiary in downtown Atlanta. The grand jury had not hesitated for a single second. The offshore wire trails and the unedited audio files I handed over were a federal prosecutor's dream, resulting in a sweeping 32-count indictment for wire fraud, extortion, and elder abuse. Denied bail due to his proven access to international money laundering networks, he was currently awaiting a trial that his own court-appointed defense attorneys admitted was entirely unwinnable. His parents had officially and legally abandoned him, freezing his trust fund and issuing a sterile public statement denouncing his actions. The man who once believed he was the untouchable king of Atlanta real estate was now just an inmate number staring at a cinder-block wall and bartering for extra phone time. 15 miles north at Lenox Square Mall, Chloe was experiencing her own custom-built purgatory. The pampered golden child who had once spent her afternoons casually dropping thousands of dollars on designer accessories was now standing on the opposite side of the glass display cases. She was working the cosmetics counter at a high-end department store, forced to wear a stiff black polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. Her bank accounts had been completely seized by federal investigators the moment Trent was indicted, leaving her absolutely penniless. The Blackwood family had changed the locks on her penthouse before the gala had even finished. Now she lived in a tiny ground-floor studio apartment, frantically selling off her collection of Birkin bags and Louboutin shoes on online consignment sites just to make her monthly rent. The ultimate humiliation came daily, when the very same Buckhead socialites she used to gossip with would walk past her counter. They would look right through her, avoiding eye contact, as if her newfound poverty was a highly contagious disease. My parents had landed exactly where their suffocating pride dictated they never would. The bank had aggressively auctioned off the historic family mansion to a commercial developer who planned to raze it to the ground. Without the sprawling estate, the luxury cars, or their drained retirement accounts, Calvin and Evelyn were forced to relocate to a cramped, poorly ventilated two-bedroom apartment in a dreary, aging complex 30 miles outside the city limits. The fallout from the public exposure of Trent's scheme had forced the church board to demand Calvin's immediate, unconditional resignation. They stripped him of his pastoral titles and completely froze his pension. He now spent his days working as an inventory clerk at a massive hardware store, taking orders from managers half his age. His booming, authoritative voice was reduced to a defeated, exhausted whisper. Evelyn had become a complete recluse. Stripped of her country club memberships and her carefully curated social standing, she refused to leave the apartment. She spent her days sitting on a cheap, sagging sofa, staring blankly at daytime television, entirely isolated in the agonizing silence of a phone that never rang. The contrast in my own life was staggering. While they were suffocating under the weight of their own consequences, I was finally breathing. I stood in the massive open-concept kitchen of my midtown penthouse, the warm evening air drifting in through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors. The space was alive, vibrating with the kind of loud, joyful, unpretentious laughter that had been strictly forbidden in my childhood home. I was hosting a Sunday dinner, but there was no rigid seating chart, no agonizing prayers for performative piety, and absolutely no anxiety. The long oak dining table was covered in platters of roasted vegetables, perfectly seared steaks, and an assortment of incredible wines. Surrounding the table was my true, chosen family. Jordan was at the head of the table, loudly recounting a ridiculous negotiation from our latest corporate acquisition, waving a wine glass in the air, while the room erupted in laughter. Sitting next to him was our brilliant lead forensic accountant, along with several of my closest mentors and colleagues from Vanguard Holdings. These were people who respected me for my mind, my integrity, and my relentless drive. They did not care about my marital status. They did not compare me to a fictional ideal, and they never asked me to shrink myself to make them feel larger. They celebrated my ambition and elevated my spirit. I walked over to the custom mahogany bar cart near the edge of the living room, grabbing a heavy crystal tumbler. I poured 2 fingers of a rare 20-year-old reserve bourbon. The rich amber liquid caught the light of the modern chandeliers above. I smiled a genuine, completely unburdened smile, listening to the cacophony of joy echoing through my home. Leaving the lively debate at the dinner table behind, I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound balcony. The humid, sweet Georgia air enveloped me. The Atlanta skyline stretched out in every direction, a glittering, endless sea of lights, towering skyscrapers, and bustling highways. It was a city I was actively helping to rebuild, a city where my firm was setting new standards of accountability, and a city that now knew exactly who Maya Preston was. The Vanguard Fund had launched beyond my wildest expectations. In just 6 months, we had provided elite legal and financial defense for over 40 elderly families, neutralizing predators and recovering stolen assets. I had taken the deepest, most agonizing trauma of my life and weaponized it into an impenetrable shield for others. I had permanently broken the generational cycle of manipulation and deceit. I rested my hands on the cool glass railing, looking down at the streets below. I thought about Evelyn, Calvin, and Chloe. I did not feel anger toward them anymore. I did not feel pity either. I felt absolutely nothing. They were ghosts from a past life, permanently locked outside the gates of the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I raised the crystal tumbler of bourbon to the glittering skyline, watching the amber liquid catch the reflection of the city lights. It was a silent, private toast. A toast to breaking toxic cycles, to surviving the fire, and to embracing true, uncompromising independence. And above all, a toast to the sweetest, most silent revenge of all living, a spectacularly successful, relentlessly happy life. I took a slow, burning sip of the bourbon, letting the warmth spread through my chest. My smile widened, reaching my eyes completely free from any shadows. The screen fades to black. The most profound takeaway from Maya's journey is that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior or emotional manipulation. True strength lies in recognizing your intrinsic value and having the unwavering courage to walk away from those who continually diminish you. Healing begins the exact moment you stop waiting for validation from people incapable of giving it. By severing ties with her abusive relatives, Maya proved that the ultimate revenge isn't destruction. It is building a spectacularly successful, peaceful life on your own terms and surrounding yourself with a chosen family who genuinely respects and uplifts you. Share your own experience of setting difficult boundaries in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories of resilience and self-discovery.